So natural coffees, there's a history to them that they produce naturals in areas that either didn't have access to water, where the farmers wanted to keep the skins in some cases, or where they just didn't want to make the investment. It was just the cheapest way to create a lot of coffee. And Brazil's a great example of where that was the tradition. So it's kind of an ignoble history of naturals. Now you have naturals being produced in many areas that didn't traditionally do them because they had the water and they were doing washed coffees. But the market suggested that they could either create more flavor in coffees that were kind of ordinary, for example in El Salvador, or they could make something really sort of exceptional in a small quantity, and that's happening in Panama or in Yirgacheffe or areas of Ethiopia that didn't normally do dry processed coffees. Now, some of the problems with that is that the climate may not be right in those areas, and the coffee may not dry enough quickly. I've heard anything from 12 to 15 days on the drying bed should be enough to get that coffee to a stable, hard dried pod. And if it's not, you get these secondary fermentations that start taking over, or these bacterial fermentation or mold or mustiness. So it's not always a good idea, and we basically try to avoid buying coffees, naturals, from areas where we feel that the climate's too wet. So natural coffee's been created for quality, for taste, but they've also been created because they're cheap. So, and it's a cheap process, and it requires a lot more human labor, but it requires a lot less machinery. Now, the problem with naturals is in wet processing, you get to float out underripes and defect coffee and floaters where the green bean didn't germinate or didn't mature inside of the parchment. And with naturals, all of those things have to be found visually and by hand. So it requires a lot of labor, and you can result in a really premium product like these Ethiopian naturals that are very carefully selected. You know, they're from not a traditional natural area, dry process area, but they have access to a lot of labor. They employ a lot of people to do this, and they get a great tasting coffee. Now, on the flip side, these Brazils here, these are two sort of supposed to be specialty but sort of market grade Brazils, created in bulk. A lot of this goes into commercial coffee. When you get to really low grades, it goes to instant coffee. Or people that want to say, oh, it's Arabica on the label, not that means it tastes good. And these coffees are the other side of the coin. I mean, it's drying, it's unclean, it has a hard flavor. There's very little positive that you can describe about these sort of generic Brazils. And this cup's just, this cup I actually tasted already. This cup was moderately clean. This cup is just moldy. It's got a mold problem. And that's a problem with these sort of low-grade naturals, is uniformity. One cup can be good, one cup is terrible, because you're talking about a high defect count. So when you say dry processed coffee, you don't want to always say, oh, I love dry processed coffee. It means a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts and results in a lot of different quality levels in the final cup. Now here we're talking about the dry process. So this is a new crop Aricha sample, and it's very tropical, actually pretty restrained, pretty mild. And one of the interesting things is I've let this rest now for 3 days. A lot of times we cup the coffees the next day after roasting. And with dry process, I really feel like you get a better read on them after 3 days or so. So you should always let the coffees rest and see what you get. Really beautiful tropical fruit, almost like a peach sherbet flavor in that. Still not quite their best coffee because it's the first picking of the year, but so this Cochere Grade 1 Yirgacheffe is definitely an example of a very restrained, clean flavor. It doesn't have any of these out there super winey fruits. I mean, it's definitely got a lot of dried apricots and some mango, but nothing too crazy, nothing too rustic, too wild. So that's a safe bet for people who are interested in dry process but usually buy wet process coffees. You want to look for those keywords in reviews. Well, this Dumersos Sidama, it's not as crazy as I expected from the smells. I thought it was going towards total like ferment. It's a little winey, but maybe it was going to end up fermenting in the cup. It's not, but it tastes a little dull and doesn't have the sweetness in the finish. So it's kind of a standard Sidama type dry process coffee. But the main point here, Ethiopian naturals and Yemen naturals can be really wild cups. You can have fruit leather or fruit flavors that are really extreme, leathery notes like Heidi, earth. So if those don't sound good to you, definitely read the review and don't buy those coffees if you're used to clean, wet process coffees. Oh. And, all naturals are not created equal. I mean, the reason they do naturals sometimes is for quality, but sometimes it's for price because it's cheap. This Brazil natural is bordering on musty. It's got a hard, dirty flavor. It tastes like a truck stop coffee. Even it's Arabica, but it's a really crappy coffee. So this is commercial grade coffee, and that's dry process can be that too. And this Cerrado is kind of a neutral, pretty good coffee. A lot of body, which you will get more body with natural coffees, and just a good thick cup. Not that special, not that much acidity, which a dry process will create a more toned down acidity in most coffees. So those are some of the things to expect from dry process coffees.